Thank you so much for being here. This is a fantastic panel, and I think this is the classic CyCon 10 panel. Because when CyCon started 10 years ago, it was really the only conference that was coming out and talking about cyber conflict. You know, not cybersecurity or information security, but specifically to talk about these areas of warfare, of the role of militaries and societies. So to me, it is the perfect place and the perfect panel to come together and talk about what do we think we know about cyber conflict and how do we know that. It's a topic which fascinates me and I've really tried to spend a lot of time on, working now with my colleague Bob Jervis at Columbia with a Minerva grant from the DoD to look at the dynamics of cyber conflict. Because I think it's so important to look at the things that we think we know, right? If at the beginning of almost every paper on cyber conflict, every book, every talk, will a lot of times start out with what we think we know. And if we were going to go around the room here to show what we think we know, we would hear things like network speed forever changing. For a while, you'd hear difficulty of attribution or attacker advantage. And these are the things that we tell ourselves about this field. And some of them are undoubtedly true, like network speed. As a matter of fact, network speed is one of those that's probably like physics, right? We can't imagine an internet that doesn't move at the speed of light, or that's a scale-free network. Others, when we say, well, they're borderless or it's attacker advantage, well, those are things that could change, right? They may only be true about the internet or cyber conflict today, but it might not be true in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. You know, we've seen we've seen difficulty of attribution start to change over the last couple of years, where that thing that we thought we knew was true is now less true, and we're having to change our theories, our operations, our practices as we go around that. Others are just about our state of mind, right? When we say, well, it's difficult definitions or it's difficult authorities. Well, that has nothing to do intrinsic with the field. That's just the way that we approach it and the way that we think about it. So with the Cyber Conflict Studies Association, we have an annual State of the Field conference, a workshop that looks at these. And so I think we've really got a fantastic panel that's going to look at some of these issues. They'll be going through, several will be using slides. All of the papers are in the book. So if you want, you can flip through and read the abstract and follow along if that is useful to you. So for the next 70 minutes or so, first the panelists are going to introduce themselves. Then we'll go for 10 minutes for each of the speakers, going as the order that they're seated. Then we'll come and have a discussion amongst themselves. As we do that, I'll start looking for hands for people to start calling on, and that's how we'll finish off with the Q&A session. I'll try and do that earlier rather than later. And so with that, let's go on to the introductions. Chris.
Hi, my name is Christopher White. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness at Virginia Commonwealth University in the United States. I run the cybersecurity curriculum for that school. I teach broadly on cyber conflict issues as well as international security, more broadly writ, and political risk strategies. I'm undertaking a lot of research that is cyber-oriented, but my main areas of interest, I research and publish on cyber-enabled information warfare. Some of what I'm doing right now is focused actually on assessing the impact of Russian bot-based activities over the last few years in Europe and North America, as well as the role of non-state actors in cyber conflict, and more recently, applications of artificial intelligence.
And we're in the introductions. I'm not supposed to moderate during the damn introductions, but like, this connection of cyber-backed information operations and influence, right? This is one of the things that was core to our field 20 years ago, and we moved away from it. And so what do we know and how do we know it? Now we're having to knit that back in. It was one of the things that we dropped, and now we're having to fold it back in. Commander.
My name is Commander Dr. Robert Koch. I'm working at the Cybersecurity Center of the Federal Armed Forces. My disclaimer now in the beginning, I'm not talking for the Federal Armed Forces here, only from a research perspective. So I do my research at the University of the Federal Armed Forces in Munich, and also giving lectures at the University of Bonn, working in the area of cybersecurity, and from a military point of view, building up penetration testing capabilities at the forces at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you. Welcome.
Hi, my name is Martin Labicki. I teach midshipmen. That makes me a government worker, which means the usual caveats apply. And you can Google everything else.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right, Chris, if you
Okay, great.
kick us off.
Well, thank you as well. Thank you all for being here. I'm presenting a paper that can be found in the conference proceedings. I will likely brush over a number of things, and so please do go ahead and read the paper itself. And I should also note up front that this is part of a collaboration. So I have 3 co-authors on the paper, Brandon Valeriano, who's sitting right there. Please direct complaints to him. Benjamin Jensen, they're both professors at Marine Corps University, and Ryan Manus, who is at the Naval Postgrad School in Monterey, California, the Lucky Devil. And so this paper is a part of a broader set of projects that we're engaged in, focusing on developing better resources for scholarly research into cyber conflict issues. So the paper we've written There we go. The paper we've written for this venue rests quite simply on 2 sets of concerns that we have about the conduct of cyber conflict research as it happens right now. And it's concerns I'm sure that are shared by many of you here. First and foremost, what we're concerned about is a seeming lack of general data resources and opportunities available for performing research for scholars and security practitioners that are interested in developing better understanding of cyber conflicts, the utility of different forms of cyber aggression, and so on. So I don't want to kind of start by overstating things. It's true that, 2 or 3 decades ago, social scientists weren't doing too much in cyber conflict. The past 10 to 15 years, that's not been so much the case. There's been a lot of excellent research, a lot of new programs, and a lot of new resources that have been made available to political scientists, so political scientists particularly, wanting to study cyber conflict. But at this time, what we're concerned about is the fact that few comprehensive data resources actually exist, the use of which might allow researchers, quantitatively at least, to generate inference and theory about when and why cyber conflict occurs. And I'm saying few resources, and the truth of the matter is that incident data, event data, which is the bread and butter of a lot of political science research on international security issues, incident data on cyber conflict really doesn't exist. It's found in a few places, but even in those places, the most prominent major databases that study conflict issues broadly writ, they tend to leave out major cyber incidents, and they certainly don't do things like link different parts of sophisticated APT campaigns over a series of years. In fact, to our knowledge, and this is a tad self-serving, but there's only one data set that's really emerged over the past half-decade or so that's really looked at cyber conflict in a detailed and replicable fashion, and that's the dyadic cyber incident and dispute data set, which, full disclaimer, was developed by Brandon and Ryan, 2 of my co-authors on this piece. But even with that data set, as my co-authors freely admit, that effort was designed to be an initial foray, and it specifically selects on certain kinds of rivalrous relationships. And so we're still left at this point in time basically being a field that lacks the kind of data resources that are commonly found in other conflict and crime research programs, like on terrorism, extremism, piracy, militarized interstate dispute, and more. So why is this the case? Why don't we have these resources right now? You've seen this kind of slide a million times, I know. The reason we don't have these data resources is largely because of the second set of concerns we have, and these concerns are frankly just the most common feature of methodological debates on cyber conflict issues. So simply put, we face significant ontological and epistemological challenges. I'm not going to go any deeper on that, really, but if our findings in research are constantly coming from limited observations, how can we ever really create generalizable knowledge about this subject? And even if we solve problems about how to get good data, if the data is biased in any way, then how can we actually ensure that we know what we know? How can we guarantee our descriptions of when and why cyber conflict occurs? And so these challenges, as you know too well, manifest in unique ways when it comes to cyber conflict research. Mostly, the attribution of cyber events is not always feasible, and it's true on a couple of fronts. So the method is covert is the main one, I think worth noting. It simply isn't possible we'll always be able to observe every cyber event, every output of a cyber conflict action. Often events go unnoticed by their victims, attempts to actually intrude fail and don't get noticed by the victim. And of course, victims and stakeholders that might give us good data are often motivated by reputational, financial, or political costs. They fail to report that an attack has taken place as a result. And moreover, the way that the domain actually functions, again, as you all know, means that we can't easily project the frequency of otherwise invisible events in the way that scholars in terrorism studies or extremism studies might. So even where indicators suggest the existence of a cyber conflict incident, again, validation usually requires the cooperation of either victims or infrastructural stakeholders, commercial vendors, backbone operators, web service providers, etc. And so adding to all of these are dual challenges of bounding scope and controlling for negative cases. We talk about this more extensively in the paper. I'll generally put that to one side for now, but briefly, successful cyber operations might include thousands of individual intrusions. How can we bound those? How can we think about those events without the benefit of foreknowledge? And with negative cases, what we have to do is acknowledge the fact that only successful intrusions or significant attempts tend to get reported in the public sphere. So how can we as scholars actually assess the full scope of the domain if we're not possessed of the full breadth of information that should be made available to us, or we'd like to be made available to us? So our effort here is partly an effort to address these pervasive concerns about what's possible with cyber conflict research, and partly an effort to demonstrate the efficacy of large-scale data collection, large-scale approaches to parsing and curating usable OSINT information, open source information of cyber conflict from the volumes of information we have before us in the public sphere. So our main criticism that we levy in this paper of those who argue that much covert action just fails to generate observable data points is that this problem fundamentally misunderstands what we're talking about when we're talking about covert action in cyberspace. Covert action simply implies difficulty in determining responsibility or the existence of an action, but not that an action actually took place. And so beyond this basic rebuttal, we make a few other arguments that I just want to go through very quickly about why researchers should attempt to undertake open-sourced collection of information on cyber conflict trends. So the first of these is quite simply that the field is in dire need of an extensive base of core knowledge and assumptions, core theoretical knowledge about how cyber conflict manifests and what it looks like. There's a whole political science and social science thing I could go into here about the development of research programs, and there's a whole hot set of debates over it. But the general idea and the general point of consensus by social scientists is that research programs are layered bases of knowledge with peripheral hypotheses on the outside linked to core assumptions. And we assess these peripheral hypotheses with the aim of advancing the state of a given field. We don't actually have that much yet with cyber conflict studies. This is a field still in its infancy, I mean, arguably maybe just out of its infancy, but the condition of general core knowledge at the heart of the research program remains remarkably unclear. We also argue that the use of public-facing information by scholars to attempt to construct comprehensive data on cyber conflict issues is necessary because otherwise we're going to struggle to link knowledge of cyber incidents to broader socio-political context. And this is particularly, as Jay just mentioned, with the link between cyber conflicts and information warfare. This is particularly important now when we're starting to acknowledge once again that cyber conflict is not a discrete phenomenon. It is all other forms of conflict manifesting in unique and new ways. And we also, regardless of the criticism that some actions won't be captured, we argue that there are clear benefits from public-facing data collection on cyber conflicts on a large scale, specifically because it's being collected at scale. So shifting to machine coding schema, the way that terrorism studies and extremism studies scholars have, that collects disparate sources from all manner of source, so social media, traditional news media reporting, government and industry documentation, and so on, is good for our analytic purposes. These combined observations, even if they remain imperfect, are orders of magnitude better than any one case reporting line. So, and very briefly, because I don't want to go over my time here, to demonstrate the utility of an approach that we're suggesting here, we supplement our arguments in the paper by applying Petrarch 2. It's a commonly used set of Python programs that basically treat text to produce event data, and we apply this to a corpus of several 100,000 news articles that were gathered and curated to focus on cyber conflict issues in the United States over a 2-year period. And the idea for us here was essentially to try and replicate past efforts. In this case, we were trying to replicate the dyadic cyber incident data set that Brandon and Ryan had previously produced. Just very briefly, so our results, we focused on American experiences with cyber conflict in 2013 and 2014, and our results were quite promising. So just briefly, let me walk you through a couple of these. What you're seeing here is the raw count of incidents we found involving the United States over that 2-year period. So 512 major cyber incidents that we found. 279 directly involved the United States, 213 of those that we specifically had the mission code involved the government directly in some fashion. This, as many of you know, actually, this busy period right here, between March and July in 2014. This contains several well-known incidents that involve US government agencies and major companies. This is the Target hack, the OPM hack, and so on. Our approach also automatically treats text to annotate specific cyber incidents for different techniques used and different perpetrators. So what you can kind of see here is that while a lot of what is reported on the public sphere ends up being labeled as a cyber attack, we find most evidence of incidents actually taking place when it's reported on in the form of state agencies attributing an attack or trying to arrest a suspect. That itself, I think, is an interesting point worthy of further discussion on the data collection front. We also, on the attribution side of things, naturally find that a substantial number of incidents that we found, they're not linked when you're coding in this way to a particular aggressor, but we also kind of unsurprisingly find that a lot of what happens, or at least a lot of what happened in this period, were linked to Russia, China, and well-known throughput countries, Moldova, Malaysia, and so on. We also see evidence of actor-specific usage of cyber instruments in line with established knowledge. So Russia, for instance, is most often linked with malware employments rather than directed degradative attacks. And most importantly, just finally, what we did was we compared our own effort to that of this data set that came before us. In the same period of time, that data set found 21 major cyber campaigns. And we found 14 of those. So that's about a 65% success rate. And so given that this was a relatively small demonstration on our part, we think this is pretty good, clearly promising, particularly because several of these that we didn't catch, information on them was only released the year following that we had information, input information for. And so let me just finish up right there. I would finish up just by saying that obviously no data collection approach is perfect. I'm looking forward to discussing it. There are remarkable issues even with using the tools that we're suggesting political scientists, social scientists need to start using. The main drawback to using what we've advocated for here is that a lot of these tools are dumb. Right? They're remarkable, they're very useful, but it still relies on appropriate research design, on us not baking bias into the design and the implementation processes. And so given the kind of data we need to produce better context in this field, I think we've got work cut out for us over the next few years.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, when I was thinking about the 10th event of the successful conference last year, I thought it's time to have a look at what happened in the cyber domain and what can we see and how to interpret it. So everybody very well knows the origin, the DDoS attacks on Estonia in 2007 that eventually led to the foundation of the CCD-COE and this conference. And that's quite a time ago. DDoS is a very trivial attack mean, but having a look nearly 10 years later, so in 2016, for example, the DDoS attacks on Dyn were able to show nearly same consequences. So hundreds of vendors were hit by that indirectly because it was on the an attack on the DNS system, not the vendors itself. But because of that, millions of users had access to, for example, Amazon or Twitter or other services in the United States. Having a look also a little bit on the net losses, that's very difficult to estimate. But for example, a recent study by McAfee said that we have about $600 billion worldwide of net losses based on cybercrime. So it seems that there is not a really good improvement in the security area there. So we took a look on some significant cyber incidents, and of course it's quite important to talk about what is a significant cyber incident, because there are a lot of statistics out there where even a ping or a scan of a system is counted as an attack on a system, and that's not really helpful. You can't work with the data. So if you have a look, for example, to the statistics from the Center for Strategy and International Studies, they offered that the first time, I think in 2006, I started with 2007 because of these 10 years. And you can see that the significant cyber incidents are definitely on a big rise, especially during the past years. So we took a look a little bit closer to why our cybersecurity measures obviously still fail and what's going on there in the cyber domain. In the heart of the publication, so please read the paper, we have this timeline. We picked up a lot of these incidents and identified different relations and conclusions. For example, what about trivial attacks, sophisticated attacks, or other things like, for example, preparing the battlefield. I will talk about that in a minute. And what are the connections? So definitely not the time to talk about everything that we identified, but giving you hopefully a little bit appetite to read the paper. When talking about what we know, of course, it's quite important to realize what we don't know. In the area of cybersecurity, very well known are the common vulnerabilities and exposures. So a database where a lot of the known vulnerabilities are in. So in real world, you can go scan your system for these vulnerabilities, close these vulnerabilities, and hopefully you have a much better security level. But the interesting question is, how good is this security level in the real world? These examples are the vulnerabilities for the Microsoft Windows operating systems over a couple of years. But if you go into the details of the things that is within these statistics, you can identify that the publications of vulnerabilities strongly depend on the research focus of some companies and some single persons in the research field of the security area. So only having a look into the statistics doesn't give you a picture or a good mindset on the security of your system, because you can close down everything that's found in the database, but you haven't any idea what's really left with vulnerabilities in some of the systems. One of the things we identified, I call it preparation of the battlefield, and I'm highlighting only a few aspects during the past 10 years. Not going, of course, into the details. Some of these events we could see are quite obvious, a preparation of the battlefield, others are not. So please have a look to the publication. We describe why we are the mind that this is all within the preparation of the battlefield. Only highlighting a few. So starting with configure, everybody will remember this quite famous worm because it was very aggressive and quite difficult to catch. It has a number of versions and really learning from the defenders how to improve their attack. But the important thing about that, only the last version that deleted itself after about 1 month had a payload with it. So you can see, okay, someone more tried out something if it's really working in the real world. And of course, having a look at the events in the Ukraine a few years later, so the blackouts in December 2015 and 2016, that's even more the cause. So especially the second one in December 2016, where the power outage only affected another part of Kiev, it is quite obvious that somebody tried out if something is working, but it was not planned as a real broad attack that should disable the complete power grid. The chances with a malicious software were quite good to do that, but you can really say, okay, some players are at the moment using the Ukraine as a test field to identify what's possible and what's not. So we collected a few other things, and of course, very important for the preparation of the battlefield are some actions of hacking industrial control systems and critical infrastructures, not only in the UK, but throughout Europe. And in some of these events, we could find installed backdoors and something like that, so where the attackers prepare the systems for later access. Because there are a lot of bad news, I included a slide with good news. During the past years already, and with an outlook to the near future, there are quite some technologies which can be used to improve the cybersecurity arena a lot. But as always, there is no holy grail. So sometimes, especially blockchain, during the past 2 years, it's named everywhere, but like in every case, you have to identify where can I use it and what for. It's not the holy grail for everything and improves the security of everything. There are challenges. For example, also in the quantum area, these computers can do, if they finally arrive, a lot for cybersecurity, but not everything. So you really have to go to the details how to affect the cyber arena with that. So having a look to the next 10 years, what might happen, the super exponential growth rate of IT improvements, that's definitely the case. There are some good evaluations highlighting that, and that's an important case, because what we are seeing nowadays, that's not what's happening in the labs. That is the technology from the past 10 years that's now arriving on the mass market. But there's much more coming on, and we have to deal with that. For example, we will have practically unlimited storage quite soon. For example, you can store about 215 petabyte of data within 1 cubic millimeter of DNA. And if you follow the news, Microsoft announced that they will provide some DNA storage by 2020 in the Azure cloud. So that's only 2 years ago. That will not be a full-blown system, more a demonstrator to show the capabilities, but you see how much and how fast of these new technologies are arriving. Quantum supremacy, that can be quite soon. Google announced a new processor only a few weeks ago, and within that context they said they may reach quantum supremacy, so when we have machines in that area that are more powerful than the most powerful traditional systems in that area, so solving new problems, that may arrive even in a few months. And of course, with a look at the military forces, a lot of systems are completely dependent on IT nowadays, and that will improve. DARPA projects, for example, did great work on exoskeletons, or have, for example, a look at erasing memories of traumas from the brain. So something like Men in Black, you come with a flashing device and erase something. There are interesting research works out there for that. Or the other way around, Matrix, loading some knowledge up to the brain. Also there are some amazing DARPA programs running at the moment. So in a few years, you will have these technologies, and that will severely have implications for our thinking about cyber domain. Self-X technologies and the power of IA, I'm not going into the details with that now. So in the end, also some recommendations, especially from a military point of view. To have assertiveness on the battlefield nowadays, we are forced to use network-centric warfare and autonomous systems, and we have the complexity trap that was also mentioned quite well in the morning. So my recommendation within that context is not to focus on the billion-dollar, very heavy and running for decades systems we have nowadays, but building cost-effective systems specifically for a mission, which are produced on time by additive production methods, for example, 3D and 4D printing. Using AI and swarm behavior, of course, there are a lot of risks too, as you surely be well aware when you visited the respective session today. For weapon systems and crypto, we need verifiable secure designs, which are already there, but in a lot of cases we don't apply them, which is quite a risk. For example, there are verified microkernels out there, but often you don't find them, but full-blown operating systems, even in our military systems. And a very important aspect that was also challenged by Bruce Schneier in the morning, the preparation of the battlefield is happening at the moment. The backdoors are introduced in the systems at the moment. So it's very important to do more for the security about the supply chain. And the last aspect for disruptive technologies, we still don't know if the quantum computer finally will work, the general one. Chances are very good. But future systems must be very, very adaptive, because we are working since a few years on post-quantum cryptography and things like that. But this is a very, very young field. So even there are good proposals for algorithms which should resist quantum technologies, we don't know if they really will. So future systems must be able to adapt very fast. You must be able to exchange algorithms in a very fast mean. And of course, we need quite flexible structures and organization to realize that. And that's quite challenging, especially for governmental institutions. There are a lot of more details in the paper, so I will be very happy if you have a look to that and come back with any questions about the topics in there later to me. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. We've had 2 days of fairly heavy discussions about cyber things. We had 2 excellent presentations this morning that, if correctly understood, should leave you fairly depressed. So what I want to do is lighten things up a bit and start my talk with an excursion into thermonuclear warfare. Yay. So take the Wayback Machine. I'm glad it has fans. So take the Wayback Machine to 1983, a time of high tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. And a Soviet military officer named Stanislav Petrov was manning the nuclear desk at the time, and all of a sudden he was getting an incoming message that the Soviet Union was under cyber attack from the United States. Best I understand, a satellite had reportedly picked up a number of missiles coming into Soviet Union. Well, the standard course of events in that case was to fire everything back at the United States, whereupon the United States would have fired its surviving weapons into the Soviet Union, and let's say that things wouldn't have ended well. But the reason that we're live today is because Officer Petrov took a look at what he was getting as input, and he said, I don't think this is a true indication of an attack. I don't think the satellite is reading it correctly. And one of the reasons he came to the conclusion was because the Soviet military doctrine had taught him that if the United States was going to carry out a thermonuclear attack, it was going to come at the Soviet Union with lots and lots of stuff. The satellite had only indicated a mere handful of stuff, okay? So he came to the conclusion that, in fact, a thermonuclear war had not begun, that it was a false alarm. The Soviet Union didn't do anything today, didn't do anything, the United States didn't do anything, and we had a happy ending. Insofar, until, of course, you get to the cyber conference, and then we're depressed all over again. But in any case, one of the aspects of kinetic world is that if you have thousands of targets, you need thousands of weapons, because there's a sort of an each's thing going on here. And if you're looking at a situation in which you don't have thousands of weapons, chances are they're not going for thousands of targets. It's probably not an existential issue. As you can probably figure it out about 10 seconds ahead of me, this isn't true in cyberspace. It isn't true in cyberspace for a lot of various reasons. One reason it isn't true is because often in military operations, and a lot of different operations, one piece of information feeds thousands of decisions. If you can corrupt the one piece of information, you can also corrupt the thousands of decisions. Another reason, which was noted by one of the morning speakers, is that if there's something wrong with a particular item you own, because it's wrong in its coding, if there's a vulnerability in that item, there's a vulnerability in every single item of that type. So that a single piece of malware, which by the way is also capable of very rapid replication, can in fact take down everything at once. And that would normally make people very, very nervous. I mean, just to give you an illustration, let us say, a random profession, that you're running a nuclear centrifuge farm, and somebody says, hey, we got problems. I discovered a piece of malware. And you don't look at the guy and you say, what do you mean you discovered a piece of malware? That's one piece of malware. We have thousands of centrifuges. What are you worried about? Well, clearly it doesn't work that way. And because it doesn't work that way, in many cases, when you have a cyber threat to your military systems, you're in a position to be a lot twitchier than if you're operating in the kinetic world and you need thousands of discrete threats to your systems in order to take it seriously. And I'm going to switch gears ever so slightly and essentially talk about a canonical challenge in kinetic operations. And that is, there's a scenario, a fairly common planning scenario, that basically says, if you're going to have a large-scale war, it's going to start with a cyber bolt out of the blue, which is going to basically make your systems much harder to use, make them unusable, make them unreliable. And then the initial period of confusion is one in which there's going to be a great deal of advantage to the attacker, to the cyber attacker, because the defenses will be befuddled. Okay? Now, let's take that as a notion, and I'm going to get to the key question here. The key question here is, what if I find something in my system that has somebody else's fingerprints on it? One of the attributes of cyberspace that makes this a unique problem is that at most stages of discovery, an intrusion for the purpose of cyber espionage is indistinguishable from an intrusion for the purpose of a cyber attack. So if you discover something in your system that comes from a hostile other party, what do you assume about the party's intentions? Okay? Conversely, if you're a country trying to carry out cyber espionage on another country's military systems, what do you do to make the other side not react in an unfavorable way? Okay, here's an instability problem that is exacerbated, not unique to cyberspace, but exacerbated by the particular characteristics of cyberspace. I don't have a good answer to the question, but like a good academic, I've got 6 alternatives. So let's go through them in order. First alternative, ignore the problem. Okay? This is called the null hypothesis. In real life, it's the one chosen most of the time. Okay, even though it never has the best cost-benefit analysis, it's almost always chosen by default. Okay, so let's forget that one. Item number 2, do cyber espionage better so you don't get caught. That's a wonderful piece of advice. It comes under the category of nice work if you can get it. Presumably, your folks are doing their cyber espionage as efficiently and as stealthily as possible, but there's a big difference between hoping you don't get caught and being certain that you don't get caught. So, yeah, you want to do that, but that's not necessarily going to solve your problem. Option number 3, don't do any cyber espionage at all. Okay? And in fact, I've given you a reason to be very, very cautious about doing cyber espionage against military systems for fear that they might be misconstrued. Okay, and now I'm going to say something that some of you may not expect. Cyber espionage is often a stabilizing element. You will hear a lot of people from the intelligence community, and there's a history to support it, that knowledge of the other side is an important element in keeping your own side from going off half-cocked because you think there's a missile gap or a bomber gap or all that sort of stuff. More often than not, the more you know about the other side, the easier it is to suppress worst-case situations. And in fact, there's another element here that's stabilizing. One of the elements of instability in the international system is surprise attack, okay? If the other side thinks that you have eyeballs into a system, the other side may think that they are not capable of carrying out a surprise attack. If they're not capable of carrying out surprise attack, that in and of itself is stabilizing. And in fact, if you want to ask me some nuclear questions, there are a couple of interesting ramifications here, but I continue. Item number 4, and at this particular case, I am speculating. Emphasis on the word speculating here, okay? Try to carry out your cyber espionage in ways that don't make it look like preparations for a cyber attack. And 2 of the speculative suggestions I have is that stick to the communications elements. Don't try to go after clients and servers you don't need a presence on, but make sure that if people discover it, they can tell themselves, oh, he's just eavesdropping. He's not trying to make things go, work funny. And the second item is to try to steal credentials rather than using persistent malware. Okay? But like I said, these are speculative. Item number 5, a lot easier to do in theory than in practice. One of the problems with discovering an implant in your system is knowing when the implant was put in, because that allows you to make inferences about the purpose of the implant. Okay? Here's the paradox. If I'm in a crisis, I am apt to scrub my systems more diligently. The more diligently I scrub my systems, the more likely it is I'll find something that I just as soon not want to see, right? And the more likely it is, therefore, that the discoveries of implants will be correlated with crises. And if they're correlated with crises, they're going to be meant as specific to the crisis. So, paradoxically, if you put an implant into somebody's systems, you want some sort of indication about when you put in the implant as a way of calming the inferences that other people are going to make about your system. Okay? And I'm going to end with a counterintuitive notion for how to deal with the problem. If the problem is that cyber espionage is going to be inferred as leading to cyber attack, do a lot more cyber espionage. That does not culminate in cyber attack. And after a while, people will get used to it, and they won't panic.
Great. Thank you very much, Martin and all. And thanks for keeping to your time. I'm going to pick up on that last point, just because it's the one that you left us on, because it's one of these differences, in getting back to the theme, what do we know and how do we know it? I've had senior folks at Fort Meade say to me, well, espionage can't be escalatory because everybody does it. And therefore, it's something that we don't have to worry about because it won't be destabilizing or escalatory. But as you pointed out, right, since as General Hayden puts it, attack is a lesser included form of espionage, then it can be this confusing. And if we have these habits of saying, well, espionage can't be that escalatory, it might lead us into these dangerous kinds of conclusions. So I'm really curious about your thoughts on the panel about what are some of these areas where maybe our instincts are of where cyber conflict and conflict are diverging and maybe gets us into trouble. But I also don't mind if one where we think they are more different, that cyber's, oh, it's so crazy different, when it actually is more similar to conflict.
Let me make 2 observations here about the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the reasons the Cuban Missile Crisis was wrapped up the way it was that both Kennedy and Khrushchev thought that something would get out of hand. Yeah. There would be an incident that would get out of hand. There were 3 incidents. 2 of them were about spy planes. One of them when a U.S. spy plane looked like it was going to wander into Siberia and may in fact have wandered into Siberia, and the second one when a spy plane was shot down. So this notion that spying doesn't implicate you in conflict isn't even true in the nuclear realm, much less the cyber realm.
Yeah, and I'm very cautious that this area of miscalculation, especially, and we're going to talk about this in one of our future questions. Cyber Command just issued their new vision where they talked about persistent engagement and that they need more agility to engage with the adversaries. And so I'm really interested. The president might be talking with a counterpart in a sensitive negotiation, and Cyber Command is off doing things like Cuban Missile Crisis, dropping practice depth charges on Soviet submarines. That's sending one signal that might be very different from the one the president is expecting. And so I'm really curious about this miscalculation. And I don't know if either of you have any of these points of where we might be closer to conflict than we think, or the places where we might be farther away from our instincts.
So with just one brief clarifying point I would add to that is you have another dynamic that you have with say, cyber weaponry that you don't have with nuclear weapons, which is that authorization need not necessarily come from on high, right? Executive authorization or even high-level military authorization is not actually consistently required for every individual intrusion, particularly if intrusions are automated after a certain point in time. And so that just frustrates the problem even further, where if you can't distinguish between espionage and attack, because of course when we're talking about cyber attack, we're inevitably, I mean, just think of the kill chain, whether or not you're a fan of it, most points in there are exploitative points, right? Up to kind of complete the mission, do whatever the actual attack function is. If they're indistinguishable, the fact that it could be somebody in a control room authorizing what they think to be a low-level interaction, because let's say you are in a set of negotiations or potentially a standoff with another country. You may think it's actually the norm that your opponent is expecting you to attack their system for reconnaissance purposes at an increased rate, and so you may be more willing, again, not at a high level, to okay these operations.
That's really interesting. Commander, anything?
Well, I think that cyber operations can be quite similar to regular operations, and that we just have to learn to demystify the cyber arena a little bit. But I think there are also quite big challenges, because all other domains are strongly dependent on cyber nowadays, and you can do a cyber attack well in advance, even not doing any hands-on when a real conflict arrives. So, for example, you can put in some sleeper functionality. A navigational system would be a perfect example that just disables a system when it's going through a specific geographical point. And then you don't have to do any hands-on that can be detected or recognized. So that's a second aspect that's completely different on the other hand.
Now, both, especially you, Robert, you had, when you're looking at your timeline, you had it in an arrow, and the arrow was going up at an angle. And you might have done that just because that fit on the slide more easily. But Chris's was similar. But I mean, they have been getting, or I mean, it seems that every year has been getting worse than each year, and other speakers have hinted at that, and that's been my experience. So one, I'm curious, do all the panelists agree that each year in general seems to have been getting worse, that the scale and scope of incidents year by year has been getting worse? Anyone disagree with that?
Spam's getting better.
Yeah, in some areas, spam has been getting better. But the intensity of cyber conflicts today seems to be blowing past places that we thought we would have been at.
And the diversity of cyber conflict as well. The diversity of conflict that we're now calling cyber, but that in actual fact looks like something else.
Right, yep. And so why do we think this is getting worse? In many other kinds of conflicts, you can see trends, right? You can see terrorism might be getting, we can see the trends go down as well as up. So what is it about cyber conflict? Is this just a period of cyber conflict we're in where it's getting worse and worse?
I think what Thomas said in the morning with his great speech is a key aspect, because we have a lot of new tools out there which are really helpful and can improve the security in the area very, very much. But on the other hand, economic-driven reasons are putting much more risk on a much faster pace into the cyber domain as vice versa.
I'm not sure I agree with the assertion. It could be a bit of balderdash. But what I wanted to note is there's a tendency sometimes for problems to go from acute to chronic. And if you're just doing counting, it looks like it's growing bigger because there's more chronic than there is acute. Okay? But it's entirely possible that looking back from the vantage point of 10 years ago, we will conclude that the peak for cyber war was in fact around 2010. Okay? Because you had Operation Orchard, in which cyber war techniques were used to disable an IAD system. You had Stuxnet. You had DDoS of this lovely country, okay, which on a nation scale has not been replicated since. You have a lot of people who were experimenting with various notions of how to use cyber and took a look at the experiments and say, nah, okay? Now, it may be too soon. So if in 10 years from now I'm totally wrong, just you didn't hear it from me, right?
But
if I'm right, you did hear it from me.
And you had Stuxnet even though it hadn't been discovered yet. So Stuxnet
That was
active
2009.
during that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. Any other thoughts on maybe why it's?
I'm tempted as well to say that year zero, as I think someone called it in 2010 or 2011, we might look back and see that as being the most intense year of cyber conflict in history. Looking back 10 years from now, I do think that we've seen again this diversification of what we're calling cyber conflict, cyber-enabled conflict of some other form. And I think the reason for that, and this is not necessarily the same thing as saying that cyber conflict is getting worse, in fact, not at all. I think the reason for that might be that, we're certainly not, I'm going to quote somebody from King's College here, I'm sure they've said it in this conference already, the nature of war isn't changing, but the character of war is constantly changing at this point in time. And in actual fact, maybe us thinking that cyber conflict is getting worse is us simply seeing the character of war changing in a much more fluid fashion over the past decade than we have up to this point. I think that the degree to which information technologies are embedded in societal functions throughout history as well. I mean, you can go back and look at the printing press or telephones or telegraphs or what have you, but the degree to which ICT get embedded in societal functions determine the degree to which ICT alter the nature of warfare. And what we've seen over the past decade is the proliferation of different forms of network-enabled technologies across societal functions. That's why this most recent information revolution, and then the kind of miniature ones, the development of social media platforms and their adoption across the globe, have been so meaningful in changing the character of war in a much more consistent fashion over the past 10 years or so.
Yeah, and I think this is really fascinating. In both, and I've really seen it this week, where I saw one very senior European general say, no, war is always about terrain. Terrain, terrain, terrain. And you couldn't get another word, it was about terrain. But we also saw General Neller here, General Petraeus hinted at this earlier in the week, of you might be seeing a fundamental change in the nature of war. And, generals don't, talking about a fundamental change in the nature of war is, they don't use that lightly. Especially the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And so I think that would be very interesting to see, are we seeing just slight changes or more massive changes? All right, I'm going to start looking around for hands. Okay, yeah, we've got Melissa here, and then we're going to go second here, and third here. Melissa, can you put your hand up? Yep.
Cheers. Hi, my name is Melissa Griffith. I'm from UC Berkeley in California. And my question goes back to the first presentation we had around the types of data we collect and the kind of reliability of the inferences we draw from that data. But we also know that researchers face a pretty serious problem with non-public facing data, specifically because of how close in proximity we are to the changes we're observing. And I have a question about, as researchers, how cautious we should be about the types of inferences we draw around certain types of questions on cyber conflict, and if you worry about whether or not our results would be substantively different on certain types of inquiries if we had access to this whole other space of data.
Yeah, absolutely. We should be extremely cautious about the inference we draw from data, the likes of which we're kind of advocating needs to be generated. This field, because of the attributes of the domain, is so unique that I actually, and I've advocated this in other published work, that I actually think the institutional format, the collaborative field level, community level, scholarly community level, that is, format, should be different here as opposed to than what it is in other areas. For one thing, I think we need to adopt a micro-foundational approach in order to validating the assumptions we generate from these kinds of data sets. If we have a book, and I actually shill for Brandon's book here, that he just launched a book, Cyber Strategy, that uses this kind of data to come to certain conclusions, to have certain findings. We should not accept that as taken. We should adopt a rigorous process, and I'd like it if we had journals in the field that were devoted to this, to be honest with you, where we replicated across a number of different formats those results, because you're absolutely right, we need to be extremely cautious about data generated in this fashion. I think we can generate good data. It will not be representative data, obviously, though. And I also think with regards to the high side of things, the classified side of things, again, I think we would do well in the field to have a kind of collaborative representation that does not exist in other fields, such that we can actually have conversations with those in the IC, those with IC counterparts in Europe, to validate our inferences with what they're actually coming up with, frankly, probably better data resources. And we can be useful to them as well here. There's a lot that the IC and governments could actually be said to do if they were able to use more robust, more replicable, and more interesting, frankly, data resources that exist in the public sphere that generate results that they found on the high side, but because of classification issues, they just can't talk about, right? They could warn us about certain things, perhaps.
Yeah, and it really strikes me the other ways that we're starting to ask the interesting questions, like the work that Jackie Schneider has been doing, and others are saying, all right, let's use cyber exercises as a way to generate testable propositions. We've got these kind of natural experiments, and we can use them and mine interesting information from them. Maybe not data, but anyone else want to pick up?
Until 2013. All the professionals would say, you never see the Russians. Therefore, we know they're really good. And you see the Chinese all the time. Therefore, they're not so good, right? Well, the reductio ad absurdum is Luxembourg must be really on top of the game because you never saw any cyber espionage with their fingerprints on it.
They might be here. Yeah.
They might well be here. You never know, right? Yeah. And that's a problem because most of the activity in cyberspace is cyber espionage, and the whole point is not to get caught.
Yeah, it really struck me when we seemed to have data coming in from Mandiant saying that the Obama-Xi agreement was being heeded to by the Chinese. That you saw this, it didn't reduce to zero, but you had this significant reduction. That how much that data was argued that it was at first it's incorrect. There has been no decrease, and when the decrease was verified, John Carlin at Justice confirmed. Then people were saying it's there, but it doesn't matter. And I think there was just that built-in bias of agreements suck. If we were done this by deterrence, then it would have been more trustworthy. And it was very interesting to see the policymakers and practitioners go that way. If there's one, it surprised me when I did my book and how much I had the people on the cleared side look at it, and it was certainly made me feel better that they thought that it carried through from the classified versus the unclassified.
And
side.
I'll just put out there as one more thought. I mean, you might not think this given the presentation I just gave. I'm an extremely conservative thinker when it comes to the data that we can use on cyber issues. I simply think that researchers in political science particularly need to be doing more, and that's why certainly I got involved with this type of project.
Okay. And I had called the second, I've got one over here. There had been one, okay, well, I don't see. So second will be here, third will be the mid.
Thank you. My name is Karsten Friis. I work at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. We work with cybersecurity from a social science point of view, and I really recognize, the challenge we have. Because how do we study it? We can see what politicians and generals say, or we can read the strategies, or we can read media, but you're kind of far away from the real thing. And it typically are inflated, or it's not really secure. So I really follow you. It's difficult to kind of find good empirics, so to speak. But at the same time, and you said yourself, it's in the context. It's always that conflict is in a context, and cyber tools are just one of many tools. And in case of Ukraine and others, we know it's going on, and it's not so difficult to. You can look at that specific context, specific incident, if it's a big political crisis. But my question, what I want to bring up is that what we rely on, as we don't have access to classified material, is typical private sector companies, like the Symantec's and the FireEyes, who provide very good information for us about what happened. But of course, they are not objective, information providers necessarily. They have an agenda and they want to sell it. They might inflate the facts as well. I don't know. But I would like your thoughts about that. How we as social scientists rely so much on the private sector on this. Thank you.
Interesting. You want to pick up on that? I mean, it's methodological, so I think it's aimed at you, but we also haven't heard from Robert for a bit, so I don't know.
I've had my, just briefly, I've had my hand in several of those data pots, and am currently actually working with a couple of those companies. I like the tools that they offer offer us as social scientists. I mean, something you can do with like Symantec data, for example, is you can look at global malware distribution, actually controlling for the number of users that Symantec has in a given country, right? So you can actually work on this representation problem that we have with just broad scope OSINT style data collection. That said, though, I'm extremely leery of the idea that you can infer about some sort of kind of global question, the scope of questions that IR scholars consistently seek to answer just from working with vendors. As I say, I'm kind of currently involved in a couple of these projects, and I don't think I've convinced myself yet that I can do more than focus on very, very tailored and specific, region-specific questions yet using this data.
Yep.
From my point of view, there are, for example, I mentioned that also in my paper, the data breach investigation reports from Verizon are a good example. They did some analysis on the cases they saw in 2015 and 16, and during the evaluation, there were also some technical conclusions, and some researchers put them up in the end and made a very detailed analysis about them. And they found out that it's absolutely not possible that these are the real reasons for these breaches. So I think, yeah, you can see a little bit because that were the cases they had seen and they analyzed. But the analysis itself was very weak. So they only did present these technical details in these 2 years, nowadays not. So also a good solution, just put the data not into the report. But often the data in these reports is very biased, so you really have to be careful with this stuff.
It really struck me when you were putting the costs up, because when I was doing my book, I came across a quote from Cliff Stoll, and he was talking about the Morris worm, and he was talking, it looks like the costs from the Morris worm were between somewhere between $100,000 and $10 million from the Morris worm, 1988. So within 2 orders of, he couldn't get it within 2 orders of magnitude. He couldn't get it pinned down. And you still see that today of, okay, it's $1 billion, it's $10 trillion of different, like we're still like 2 orders of magnitude off in trying to figure out the costs. And that was 1988. Okay, over here.
Hi, I'm Emily Klickard from the U.S. Naval Academy. My question is for Dr. Libicki. In regards to the recent cyber conflicts between the United States and other countries such as Russia, China, and North Korea, you mentioned several options with regards to dealing with cyber espionage. I was just wondering, which option do you think, with the present conflicts we're experiencing today, is the best course of option for the United States to approach with these countries? Do you think we should approach them all the same, or should we approach each nation differently, especially with the vast differences in the leadership of these nations?
That's a really good question. And a lot depends on the sort of inferences they're likely to make. Unfortunately, if you actually work the logic, it turns out that you treat the most reasonable people in the worst way, because they're the least likely to make the bad inferences, right? Of the 3 countries, I think China is clearly the most level-headed, least likely to fly off the handle under its current regime. But unfortunately, you walk the dog, that means, well, we really ought to be doing a lot of spying against China, precisely because they're not going to overreact, which is not exactly a way of rewarding their calm demeanor. I would be very, in general, I'd be extremely careful, do the sums and check them twice. For any sort of cyber espionage against these countries, oddly enough, because the North Koreans, having read the New York Times, may believe that we carried out a cyber attack against their missile system, they may be the least sensitive to it. But I'm just guessing.
Yep, any from the others? Okay. Okay, so it really struck, so I think the most important document that's come out, the biggest change in our doctrine and our thinking, almost since I've been in this business, was earlier this year when U.S. Cyber Command came out with their vision statement that did a couple of things. One, how many folks have read that, the Cyber Command vision, or the paper by Richard Hartnett? Because it said, one, we recognize that that nations are in this state of persistent engagement, right? It's also been called constant contact, right? There's not a period of peace and then a period of war. It's not even really a gray zone, but it's this persistent of the cyber forces of nations up against one another, in there throwing elbows all the time. And I thought that was such well, and they said, and therefore we need to defend forward with more agility. So there was a descriptive and then a prescriptive part of that. And to me, many of us had been writing about that and talking about that, that it wasn't necessarily discrete. But I think Richard Harknett's paper and Emily Goldman really helped bring us into this new mindset. And it was interesting because it was one of the first paradigm changes that I personally felt. And I'm curious am I out on a limb on that, or does it change the way that, for example, we might look at data, or the way that you think about history, or what might be coming up next? And after this, I'm going to do, I'm very curious about the next 10 years. Are we going to see discontinuities? And Robert's already picked up on that. That'll be the next question.
It's interesting that you talk about persistent engagement and then couch it in the language of states fighting each other. These are two different ways of thinking about the nature of cyber threats, right? Their language, and this is where the paradigm shift you describe, I think, comes in for me. The interesting thing is language over the past 5 years, 6 years or so, has consistently moved to thinking about cyber threats to national security less as some sort of warfare style of threat, and we almost talk about it more like pollution, something like that. It's something in the environment that we have to consistently consider when making strategic decisions, and it's no longer really about making strategic decisions of a particular kind, of a cyber warfare flavor. It's about couching our actions in a strategic environment that involves this constant engagement, and that creates unique, as Martin was talking about, unique institutional and psychological challenges for us.
Yeah, but I mean, EPA is not saying that they want to go in and take down polluting Chinese factories, right? I mean, but that is what Cyber Command is asking for, right? I mean, they're wanting to go into gray and red space to directly affect adversary command and control because it's persistent engagement, right? I mean, so it really is, normally Russian and, U.S. warriors going into and disrupting Russian warriors, we wouldn't mind hanging terms warfare around that.
Right.
So I mean, this is really, is this a difference, for example, in the way that we think about war, that now the adversary nations are constantly engaging one another, even though there's not bloodshed?
I certainly think it has institutional ramifications, insofar as the question of the nature of the cyber threat prompts you to simply ask, who are the stakeholders that are necessary? Who are the ones we actually need to empower in order to mitigate cyber threats? And in the particular context of Cyber Command, obviously that is their mission set. They are absolutely right to want to be able to, well, maybe not, but to want to be able to engage in those conflict areas to disrupt disruptive activities and the likes. But the institutional question more broadly, particularly considering that we've seen this diversification of what cyber conflict is should we cede that degree of responsibility on cyber capacity within the U.S. government, for example, entirely to DoD anymore?
Yeah.
I really like the picture of the pollution. With having a look at severe challenges in the cyber arena, sometimes it's really difficult to differentiate. Was it just by bad programming or something like that, or did really some powerful actor influence a process? So I think sometimes it really can be difficult to differentiate, but at least I think that the nations that have the capabilities are doing hard at the moment to put some stuff that can be useful for themselves later into the systems. Which is challenging because everybody uses the same stuff and you can have the boomerang effect.
Yeah. But it does strike me for both of your papers, and then we'll go to Martin and then we'll do the final comments about the future, in that we're used to, in political science, counting definable events. But if it's persistent engagement, then the individual events matter significantly less than the set because it's more constant.
Sure.
Or that, it struck me in the way that I have done like you've done. Like you've got the line and you put the things on the line, but when we do that, we're missing this back and forth between adversaries over time, But I read a dissertation once that tried to say that there was no escalatory effects from Stuxnet. There was no tit for tat or anything that came from it because they stopped their timeline at like 2011, right? So they didn't include the Iranian DDoS, so they said there's no impact from this. And so I think it is interesting in how we tell our stories and how we draw our lines and how we count.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just shill for my, our suggested approach in this paper
Shill.
again. Or promote our approach in this paper again, and just saying that part of the reason I think that political scientists actually need to just adopt the idea that public-facing information can be useful for our research is not because we want to talk about the content of cyber incidents. We need to gather metadata about the context in which it occurs. That is as often more important.
That's a great point. All right. I promised that we were going to cover what's coming up in 10 years. It turns out that we don't have that because we're running out of time. So Martin Levicki is going to get the final word.
Yeah,
And it better not be balderdashed.
There's a story here.
I know the story.
I took a look at the CyberCom thing, and I don't know how to evaluate it because they're talking about things that they're not really talking about. So you had to make a guess. My sense is that CyberCom is trying to raise the cost of adversary actions. But as an economist, I always have to ask the question, one, is it costing us more to raise their cost than it's worth? And number two is something called the fallacy of the last move, right? When you do something and you say, well, this is successful, I've won, until the other guy comes up with a countermeasure, and then you think, maybe my investment wasn't such a smart idea after all. So, I don't know.
Yeah. The last word is going to be, I don't know. That's actually not a bad way to leave a panel on what do we know and how do we know it of I don't know. Because the open questions are so broad. And like it brought up in the keynotes this morning, that Microsoft brought up, John Frank, of saying, look, we are in the first steps of a new digital civilization, right? We are at the very beginning edge of this. And we've got a long way to go. So with that, we don't have a long way to go with this panel. So please join me in thanking our panel.